I think most experts will argue that the technology is far ahead of regulation at this point, and that the White House is having to kind of figure things out as they go. And President Trump is really quite personally interested in this. He often says he's kind of the AI president.
He loves to surround himself with these really wealthy tech founders and NVIDIA's Jensen Huang, for example. So, I wonder if he sees himself as the one who will really empower them to continue innovating or someone who has to put the brakes on. Hey, Bernie, great to see you.
Great to see you. How's it going?
Good. It's the two of us this week as Katrina's off on summer holiday. So we have the opportunity to come together and talk about what is, of course, in August, a bit of a slower news cycle, although you never know here in Washington, D.C. I think back to last year this time, and we ended up having a summit between Presidents Trump and Putin in Alaska, which feels like ages and ages ago.
Yeah, it doesn't feel any slower to me personally. I think there's so many things happening all at once, both domestic and international, that the show goes on, as President Trump likes to say.
Absolutely. And, I thought this would be a good week to actually talk about one of these topics that is undergirded pretty much every news story that we do these days, whether it's geopolitics or domestic, and that is artificial intelligence. And it feels like there's been this crescendo of news that's really, again, brought this to the forefront. We had this series of reports, first from OpenAI, the AI company, then Anthropic, and then Meta AI, that their AI models had in testing environments broken out of those environments and actually hacked other companies. So, really troubling behavior. And then that was reported by these companies. And then you also had the White House holding this very high level meeting with the leaders of the biggest AI companies and the companies that power AI. So, NVIDIA, that makes the chips, of course, that power the AI that we use. And they are talking about this safety framework that that the White House, excuse me, has proposed on how to test new models and how to regulate it. It does kind of feel, Bernie, like an important tipping point.
It does feel like an important tipping point. I think it's actually really fascinating to watch because the technology is moving so quickly that the White House is almost in a way having to kind of sprint to catch up to where the technology is. In this meeting that took place uh, earlier this week regarding the safety framework. I mean, just there are huge kind of national and domestic security implications for AI escaping, as they said, and whether the underlying code and technology should be open and available to researchers and other people working in the space, or whether that needs to be kind of kept behind closed doors and restricted. And I think there's kind of a tension there between different companies and different, even perhaps factions of the White House about where to go from here. But it's really interesting to watch these kind of discussions happen in real time, because I think most experts will argue that the technology is far ahead of regulation at this point, and that the White House is having to kind of figure things out as they go. And President Trump is really quite personally interested in this. He often says he's kind of the AI president, and wants to promote AI as much as possible.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we should say, look, it is a challenge for any country or for any block of countries to understand how to regulate a technology that is changing so rapidly. That includes the European Union that has its own kind of set of AI rules, which the US doesn't necessarily support, at least in part. But what I think is fascinating is, this comes at a time where all of us are asking what role is AI going to play in our jobs, in our lives going forward. And if you look at polling, artificial intelligence is not popular in the US because it's been talked about in kind of these doomsday scenarios, right? AI going rogue, as we said, getting rid of jobs because they'll be replaced by artificial intelligence systems. The question of just what AI could be used to do on the battlefield. So, in warfare. What's interesting about what this White House has done is it's really kind of been pulled between these two camps, which is not unusual in the US. The camp that believes that it needs to be regulated, artificial intelligence, with some pretty secure guardrails, and those that say the more guardrails you put on, the harder it makes it for US companies who are leading the field to actually innovate. And so the White House came up with this, safety framework, which has been reported on by US media. And that's part of what these tech leaders were talking about with the White House. And this is about voluntary testing, right, Brittany? So it's about these companies coming when they have a new model and saying, we have this new model and we want to submit it to testing voluntarily before it's released to the public. The problem or the criticism with this framework as it's deemed by the White House is that it's not open to the public. So if they are testing a model on whether it's a national security risk or a threat in some way, we don't know what the parameter is for that. How are they measuring what counts as a national security risk? The other big point I think that has been made is this question of open or closed models. And I'm not the AI expert, but I can say just very summarily that an open model is one that shows kind of the coding underneath the infrastructure that created that AI system, and a closed model does not. And so the biggest US companies, OpenAI, Anthropic, they operate on closed models. And the big Chinese models, which we'll talk about, are open. So you have all these kind of points of conflict.
I think the China angle is really the subtext of this whole conversation that took place at the White House, because I mean the drive to protect American innovation and keep the US ahead of the AI curve. I mean, they're almost explicitly saying in comparison to China. And I think the Anthropic angle is quite interesting also because there is a suggestion that Moonshot, which is a Chinese firm's Kimi model, essentially stemmed from Anthropic's Fable model. Essentially, they're calling it a case of stolen technology. And I think also the big challenge for the White House is that any sort of regulation that pertains to something that could do with China is very difficult ahead of President Xi coming to the White House in September. I think AI is going to play a huge part in that conversation when he's here at the White House meeting with President Trump.
The tech enthusiasts, if you will, in the Trump administration and in his inner circle who have really advocated for the administration to take a soft touch on AI regulation have pointed precisely to those Chinese models, like Kimi, to say, look, China is developing rapidly and we need to make sure we stay on the forefront, and regulation will prevent these companies from doing so. What I find interesting is one of those tech enthusiasts was President Trump's White House czar, David Sachs, who's now left that position but remains, he's a venture capitalist, he's an investor. So he's someone who's kind of been on the forefront of technology and in Silicon Valley for years and years. And he's someone who's calling for the White House to boost OpenAI, Anthropic, these companies as much as possible. On the other side, you have some real MAGA stalwarts like Steve Bannon who say we cannot allow this technology to take over.
I think, I mean, all the reports indicate that there are kind of, even in the cabinet, there is a huge divide over the people that have taken kind of a more interventionist mindset with regards to AI and the kind of pro-tech wing, if you call it. The chief of staff, Susie Wiles, for example, reportedly is much more on the interventionist wing going forward. And I think also it's quite interesting because I mean, even though we're discussing here and it's been covered quite a lot in the media, it's not something that's been kind of hugely discussed in by the US public, other than the polls suggesting that many Americans don't like AI. And one wonders on a longer time frame whether this won't become much more of a political football, kind of the intervention versus the pro tech angle, as AI really takes much more of a larger role in our daily lives.
Yeah, and it kind of plays into that MAGA criticism of there being a group of elites that are kind of controlling the way the economy develops. And in this case, they're pointing to tech elites. And you've had Steve Bannon criticize the closeness of the Trump administration to some of those big tech leaders, like, of course, OpenAI, Sam Altman, and Anthropic, Dario Amodei, although this administration has clashed with Anthropic in particular. But despite that, one of the other big things that I think is gonna be so interesting to watch is, one, as you said, the public hasn't been as involved in this discussion, but two, we've talked about there possibly being an AI boom. So these are companies that, of course, are spending billions and billions of dollars and are valued as multi-billion-dollar companies. And a lot of that is based on the fact that they are developing this technology quickly in a closed model way. And they are, of course, advocating for those models to stay closed. There are security risks, perhaps, if you open up these models that anyone can use them and anyone can manipulate them in a way to create a threat or a weapon, for example. But as long as they stay closed, these companies can keep a really big market share, right? If they are open, then all of that money that they're valued at could kind of just burst. And there's a concern that as these companies are getting richer and richer, we don't know what exactly is underneath it, what's propping up this massive tech boom in the economy. So, if you see some of the debate around how AI is being used by average people, there's a concern that these tech titans are earning a lot of money. Their companies are earning a lot of money, but in the end, how will that actually benefit your average American? And I think that drives some of the skepticism, let's say, that you see in the polling.
Politically, either for the Trump administration or for subsequent administrations, any sort of kind of AI equivalent of the dot-com bubble of the early 2000s would be politically disastrous. No one from the White House perspective, no one wants to be the person sitting in the Oval Office when that happens. I think that also weighs on the mind of a lot of people in the administration and in government more broadly. And I think also that the American public has questions about what actually constitutes a security or a security threat or a national security risk, and the White House has so far really not defined that, which I think, from a communication standpoint, that also lets people's imagination run away with them to a certain regard, and I think that's also prompted a lot of alarm and the public opinion about AI.
Yeah, that's a really good point, especially as they're seeing, these news reports about AI models breaking out of their testing systems and hacking other companies, right? I mean, it doesn't exactly instill confidence in the public. The other, of course, big part of this that we'll, have to discuss in another episode because it warrants its own episode is the compute you need to be able to build and grow these AI systems. And that eventually then leads to data centers because they need a lot of energy. And data centers have become one of the most fascinating, really political hot potatoes in the US because President Trump, he's spoken favorably of data centers, but at the same time, you have Republicans and Democrats who have questioned whether data centers should be brought to their communities.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting to watch kind of the Republican infighting in particular on data centers because, and actually in both parties, you have wings of the party that think that it's kind of a necessary evil, if you will, and those who just don't think that they should be in communities on farmland, for example. And I think in both cases, again, there's the subtext of China and where the money from a lot of these data centers is coming, and a lot of the public debate has been about that. But that's a very, very meaty topic.
Yeah, we'll have to get to that another day. But I wonder, coming back to regulation in this Trump administration, where do you think President Trump himself comes down on this? I mean, he calls himself, as you said, the AI president, and he has kind of both voices in his ear, the tech skeptics and the tech enthusiasts. And he loves to surround himself with these really wealthy tech founders and NVIDIA's Jensen Huang, for example. So, I wonder if he sees himself as the one who will really empower them to continue innovating or someone who has to put the brakes on.
It's a tricky one because I think in this case, being broadly pro business and against regulations and pro free markets, though that all becomes very complicated with AI and where where the boundaries are. But I think President Trump is thinking about it a lot.
Yes, and I think another really important point to keep in mind there is just because we are waiting for whether there will be regulation or not in the federal level doesn't mean the states are not taking their own action. So we've seen a bunch of states take action on regulation on AI and kind of the AI Bill of Rights that we saw from Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis. They are listening to some of the concern from their own constituents and moving forward. And the AI companies say you're creating a much more difficult playing field for us if we have a patchwork of regulations. So we need federal action. So this is where President Trump and his administration could go. But I think that gives us plenty of fodder, Bernie, to perhaps come back to the data center conversation in a coming episode and chat about what we see across the country.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think this broadly, this topic, AI and data centers, I think this is something that's going to increasingly be in the public consciousness. I mean, just think about where the discussion was on AI 2 years ago and where it is now and what people use it for. I think this is just going to be one of those exponential curve topics that often come up in the US.
Well, it gives us plenty to talk about. So I guess that's it for this week. But great to see you and check in with you next week.
See you soon.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you. So please leave us a comment below or email us at path@bbc.co.uk.